Hello everyone, welcome to History and Culture. In ancient China, the lives of palace maids appeared glamorous on the surface. But in reality, they were filled with endless suffering and oppression. Many people, upon seeing the palace maids of the ancient royal courts, might think that they lived luxurious lives, wearing exquisite clothes and heavy makeup, enjoying a life of wealth and comfort. However, the truth was far from this. The fate of these maids was filled with humiliation and sorrow. The status of a palace maid was low, even more so than that of a eunuch. Their identity was almost equivalent to being a tool in the palace, used to serve the emperor and his concubines, and sometimes treated as mere objects, to be controlled at will. The life of a palace maid in the imperial palace was extremely tragic. Not only did they have no freedom, but even their basic human rights were stripped away. Their fate was entirely in the hands of those in power, be it the emperor, the empress dowager, the empress, or the concubines, who controlled their life and death. From the very beginning, the lives of these palace maids were filled with relentless oppression. When they were still young girls, they were taken from their hometowns, separated forever from their families. The identity of a palace maid meant they had no right to choose their own path. Everything about their lives was decided by those in power within the palace. Contrary to what people may imagine, their daily lives were not luxurious, but instead, filled with hard labor, strict rules, and merciless punishments. So, how did these palace maids spend their lives? What was life really like in the ancient palace? Let's take a closer look at how palace maids in ancient China lived and how they were bound by the cold and cruel rules of the palace. The selection of palace maids through the ages. In ancient feudal imperial society, the emperor's power was nearly limitless. It could be said that the whole world and its kingdoms belonged to him, and the lives of others were also in his hands. As the Book of Songs says, within the 6 directions, the land belongs to the emperor, and all the people must serve him, which means that the entire empire's land belonged to the emperor, and all subjects had to submit to him. From this perspective, the history of imperial power in China spans at least 3,000 years. To ensure that the emperor could indulge in a life of luxury, beautiful women for the imperial harem were indispensable. In fact, it can be said that all the beauties of the world were brought into the palace. This led to the saying in ancient history of 3,000 beauties in the harem. In addition, the emperor's harem and the royal daily life required a large number of staff to take care of them. And these included both palace maids and eunuchs. Initially, the sources of palace maids were relatively uniform, mainly coming from female slaves, war captives, and the wives of criminals, especially women captured in war. With the change in systems, particularly the introduction of the selection system during the Han Dynasty, the sources of palace maids gradually diversified. Every year, in the 8th month of the lunar calendar, the court would select women who were modest in appearance and between the ages of 13 and 20 from the common people to serve the royal family in the palace. These women had no right to choose. Once selected, they had to enter the palace. This selection process conveniently coincided with the time when common people paid their taxes, turning the selection into a form of tribute. During the Three Kingdoms period, the debauchery of Sun Hao, the ruler of the Wu state, led him to issue an order to select palace maids across the entire country. The scope of this selection included not only the families of commoners but also the families of officials. And many officials' daughters could not escape this fate. Typically, girls around the ages of 15 or 16 would be forced to participate in the selection. Those who were selected stayed in the palace, while those who were not selected could marry freely. Sun Hao's foolish rule caused widespread resentment among the people. And even the daughters of officials were unable to choose their own marriage. After the Jin dynasty defeated Wu, they not only took the palace maids from Sun Hao's harem but also intensified the selection system. ordering the daughters of all families below the rank of public officials to be included in the selection. To avoid being selected, many girls would deliberately make themselves look ragged and haggard in order to escape the fate of being chosen. During the 16 Kingdoms period, the tyrant Shi Hu of the later Zhou dynasty went to extreme lengths, even selecting over 10,000 women to fill his harem. In his bid to steal the wives of others, Shi Hu even forced the deaths of 3,000 men. For his own pleasure, he established a palace every 40 miles on his travels. These palaces would have a lady and several palace maids, where he would indulge in luxury during his journeys. But Shi Hu's cruelty was not the worst. During the northern Qi dynasty, the ruler Gao Wei ordered that all unmarried women aged 14 to 20 be forcibly gathered. If parents hid or concealed their daughters, they would be executed. This policy sparked strong public anger, and the people were deeply disgusted by it. By the Sui and Tang periods, Emperor Yang of the Sui dynasty ruled with even greater decadence. His harem numbered over 120 women, with many palace maids in attendance. To continuously replenish his collection of maids, Emperor Yang ordered each district to search for beautiful young girls and send them to the palace. During the Tang dynasty, the practice of selecting palace maids was no less extravagant than in previous dynasties, especially during the reign of Emperor Xuanzong. An official known as the Flower and Bird Envoy would select beautiful women from both officials' families and commoners. Those who refused could not avoid punishment and might even be executed. The Ming dynasty took the selection of maids even further. In the first year of the Tianqi era, when Emperor Shizong ascended the throne, selecting palace maids became an important task. Girls aged 13 to 16 were chosen, initially 5,000, but after multiple eliminations, only around 300 were ultimately selected. Once in the palace, the maids underwent strict training and could eventually become candidates for concubines. During the Qing dynasty, the selection system had its own characteristics. Every year, girls aged 14 to 16 from the 8 banner officials' families were required to participate in the selection. Palace maids were chosen from these girls. If a maid was too old or failed to impress, she was forced to leave the palace, and those over 25 were allowed to depart. Though the number of palace maids was relatively small, the selection process was still rigorous and determined the fate of many women. The true life of palace maids. Throughout history, the system of selecting palace maids has been absurd and tyrannical, trampling on the dignity of women. For those who were selected, their hardships were just the beginning, and their actual lives were nothing short of tragic. There was an Empress Dowager in the Ming dynasty who felt pity for the palace maids and said to Emperor Jiaqing, "Once a woman enters the palace, she loses all the joys of life. Eating, living, nothing can be done according to one's will. It's like being locked up." This statement revealed the tragic lives of the palace maids. First, the palace had many rules, and the maids had to tread carefully. As the saying goes, even when beating a dog, one must look at its owner. In the eyes of the people, palace maids were servants to the royal family. Although their status was low, compared to common women, they were seen as more elevated. They didn't have to worry about work and lived a life free from hunger. But in reality, the status of palace maids was extremely low, even worse than that of eunuchs. They were not only scolded and bullied by their masters but also mistreated by the eunuchs. The palace had many rules, and the maids had to follow strict ceremonies, even while sleeping. According to historical records, maids could not sleep with their faces up, they had to sleep on their sides with their legs tightly together, and their hands in a proper position. If they moved positions while sleeping or ground their teeth, talked in their sleep, or snored, they would face various punishments. Beyond sleeping, there were rules for eating, burping, and even farting. They ate poorly and could not fill themselves up. Spicy, oily, or overly salty foods were prohibited. If a maid's body odor caused discomfort to her master, she could be beaten. If a palace maid accidentally farts or burps while serving, it is considered a severe disrespect to the emperor and the master. For minor offenses, she might receive 50 lashes, and for more serious ones, her life could be at risk. To avoid any unpleasant odors, palace maids maintain a very light diet. After spending many years in the palace, they dare not eat foods like fish, garlic, shrimp, onions, or chives. Even when nature calls, palace maids are not allowed to leave casually. They must never tell their master they need to use the restroom, as doing so would lead to punishment. As a result, they avoid overeating, strictly regulate their diet, and manage their food intake to prevent any potential accidents. When it comes to clothing and appearance, palace maids are required to dress modestly and must refrain from speaking or acting frivolously. They cannot wear makeup, bright-colored clothes, or intricate hairstyles. Their hair accessories and overall look must be simple, or they would face punishment. The reason for these strict rules is that the masters fear their maids might catch the emperor's eye and become rivals. The worst part, however, is serving the masters. It's physically and mentally exhausting. In order to be available whenever their masters need them, palace maids must stay by their side throughout the night, often depriving themselves of sleep. Many maids, in an effort to stay alert, would place cocklebur seeds in their shoes to stimulate themselves. Living conditions for the maids are poor, as they sleep in large, remote dormitories with little privacy. For example, during the Qing dynasty, most maids lived in small, broken rooms in annexes. These rooms were low-ceilinged and sparsely furnished, often containing only a clay pot. Palace maids were forbidden from speaking loudly, running around the palace, or uttering anything considered inauspicious. To avoid making mistakes in conversation, they learned to communicate through eye contact or subtle gestures, such as nodding or pointing, which allowed them to understand each other's meaning. Because of the many palace rules, maids had to be extremely cautious, constantly worried about making mistakes. Over time, the immense mental pressure, coupled with poor nutrition and inadequate sleep, often led to health problems. During the Ming dynasty, palace maids not only had to perform their duties but were also required to study books like the Nu Sun, Women's Teachings, and Nu Shao Jing, Women's Filial Piety Classic, under the guidance of female officials. This was a form of indoctrination, aiming to make them more efficient in serving the royal family. Another key aspect of their life was the harsh punishments. With so many rules in the palace, once a maid entered, she lost all personal rights and freedom. Serving the masters was no easy task. If a maid violated the rules or made a mistake, the punishment could be severe. Common punishments included the dun sua, ti ling, and ban zhua. The dun sua was a wooden box about 20 centimeters high and a foot square, with 4 holes to lock the maid's hands and feet in place, preventing her from standing. She would be left in this position until near exhaustion before being released. The Ti Ling punishment required the maid to march in a straight line every night, starting from Qianqing Palace to Yuehua Gate and Ruijing Gate, and then back to Qianqing Palace. While marching, she had to loudly shout, "Tianxia Taiping, all under heaven is peaceful." If her voice wasn't loud enough, the punishment would be intensified. The banzhua punishment was particularly brutal. The maid had to stand facing north, bend forward to hold her feet with both hands, and keep her body straight in this position for about 2 hours. Many maids would become dizzy, vomiting uncontrollably, and some even lost their lives due to the severity of this punishment. Additionally, punishments included confinement, kneeling for punishment, facing the wall, copying scriptures, slapping the face, corporal punishment with a stick, and even being pricked with needles. Those who committed serious offenses would be locked away in the imperial dungeon or ordered to be executed. Not only would they be punished by their masters, But young palace maids with less experience would also suffer torment and punishment from older palace maids. Even if the older maid was too harsh, the younger one could only silently endure. The record of 2 years in the Qing palace mentions punishments for palace maids. Once, a maid carelessly wore 2 different socks, which greatly angered Empress Dowager Cixi. She immediately ordered another maid to slap her 20 times. The maid who was assigned the punishment softened her heart and didn't strike very hard, which led to the punished maid not suffering much. Seeing this, Cixi became even angrier and ordered the punished maid to slap the softer maid. The punished maid then used all her strength to slap the other. Point 3. Lack of personal freedom. Many palace maids, once selected into the imperial palace, would never again see their families. They were trapped in the palace for life, cut off from the outside world. Only a very small number of maids chosen by the emperor would rise to the rank of concubine, while most others would spend their days in loneliness. When they were young, the maids served their masters, but as they grew older, they were assigned to the laundry rooms to wash clothes or perform other menial tasks. Only on major occasions, like the emperor's ascension to the throne or his birthday, would a few maids be allowed freedom. In the early Tang dynasty, when the nation was weak, Emperor Taizong, Li Shimin, released over 3,000 palace maids to marry freely, in order to win the people's favor and save expenses. Other emperors in the Tang dynasty followed this example, releasing maids during natural disasters or when a new emperor ascended the throne. In the Ming dynasty, there was no established practice of releasing palace maids. It was only done occasionally. For example, after Emperor Yingzong Zhu Qizhen was restored to the throne, following the advice of the official Li Xian, he sent most of the older maids back home. Some of these maids had been in the palace for decades. The released palace maids either married and found happiness, or returned home to care for their parents. But many others had nowhere to go and wandered in the civilian world, living aimlessly. However, no matter the outcome, these maids were considered free and, after death, could be buried. On the other hand, most palace maids continued working in the palace until their youth faded and beauty was gone. They were then sent to nunneries or imperial tombs to serve past emperors, guarding graves. Their lives ended there. Point 4. No place for burial after death. In many dynasties, if a palace maid fell ill, she would not receive medical treatment. If a maid became sick or disabled, she would be sent to a designated place to do hard labor, continuing to be exploited until she either died from the illness or old age. During the early Song dynasty, if a maid contracted a serious illness, she was often sent to a nunnery to wait for death, and the result was that 8 or 9 out of 10 would die. It wasn't until the reign of Emperor Shenzong that the emperor took pity on these maids and allowed imperial physicians to treat them. In the Ming dynasty, there was a regulation stating that, if a concubine or maid below the rank of concubine fell ill, doctors could not visit them, they could only prescribe medicine based on symptoms. The history of the Ming palace records, when a palace maid became ill, aged, or committed a crime, she would be sent to a specific place to wait for a long period of time, after which she would be assigned to the laundry department. This means that if a maid fell ill or grew too old to work, she would be sent to a place where she would continue to labor to earn a living, highlighting the tragic fate of these maids, who were oppressed in the palace and left to rely on fate when ill, with no medical care. As a result, palace maids had no support, could not marry, and when they died, they had no place to be buried. They would be casually cremated and their ashes scattered in abandoned wells. Some maids, before they died, would even beg others to scatter their ashes lightly. During the Jiaqing period, a noble consort, seeing that palace maids had no proper place to be buried after death, specially bought several acres of land so that those maids who didn't want to be buried in a pit for corpses could be buried on that land. However, the most tragic fate befell those palace maids who were sacrificed in the emperor's tomb. After Emperor Qin Shi Huang's death, a large-scale human sacrifice took place. Historical records state, Emperor Urshi said, "It is inappropriate to release those in the emperor's harem who have no children." So they were all sent to be sacrificed, and many of them died. Thus, it is believed that all the women in Qin Shi Huang's harem were sacrificed alive, and the number of these women exceeded 10,000. After the Han dynasty, the practice of burying consorts and palace maids alive was essentially abolished. However, by the early Ming dynasty, this custom resurfaced. During the reigns of Emperor Taizu, Emperor Chengzu, Emperor Renzong, Emperor Xuanzong, and Emperor Jingdi, living burials became a common practice in the royal family. The women who were sacrificed were of low status, mostly palace maids who had no rights. The methods of sacrifice were mostly hanging or starvation. As mentioned in the Li Chao Shilu, the historical records of the Li dynasty. When the palace maids were to be sacrificed, around 30 of them committed collective suicide. On the day of their deaths, they first had a hearty meal, then were led to the palace hall, where they lay on prepared wooden beds, with ropes ready above their heads. They were then made to hang themselves. Before their deaths, most of these maids were filled with despair and cried uncontrollably. Before his death, Emperor Yingzong of the Ming dynasty, Zhu Qizhen, abolished the living burial system, and from that time onward, the practice ended in the early Ming period. However, during the early Qing dynasty, living burials became popular again. It wasn't until Emperor Kangxi issued a decree banning the practice of servants being buried alive with their masters that the living burial system finally disappeared. 3. Abused by the royal family. The relationships in the imperial palace were chaotic. And the palace maids were the lowest in status. They were often treated as playthings by the emperors, routinely abused and trampled upon. During the Three Kingdoms period, Sun Hao, the ruler of Eastern Wu, had a very bizarre and twisted personality. To satisfy his abnormal desires, he would whip the palace maids every day. During the reign of Emperor Xuanzong of the Tang dynasty, winters in Chang'an were extremely cold. To keep warm, Xuanzong would summon the palace maids into one room and have them stand in a circle around him. After a while, the room would warm up. During this time, Xuanzong would use the bodies of the palace maids to warm himself. Even though the maids were shivering from the cold, they dared not speak a word, fearing they would anger the emperor. During the reign of Emperor Guangzong of the Song dynasty, Empress Li was particularly ruthless and cruel, even toward the palace maids. According to historical records, once the emperor was washing his hands in the palace and noticed that one of the maids had very fair hands. He became quite fond of her. Some time later, the empress sent the emperor a food box, and when he opened it, he was horrified to find the two hands of the maid inside. Emperor Guangzong was so frightened by the sight that he fell ill. Ming emperors were extremely harsh with the palace maids, and many lost their lives under the emperor's cruelty, without any dignity. In 1410, the beloved concubine of Emperor Chengzu, Zhu Di, named Quan, suddenly died. Zhu Di was deeply saddened and, in a fit of rage, accused the palace maids of poisoning the tea. This led to the execution of hundreds of palace maids and eunuchs. Later, he suspected that the maids and eunuchs were having illicit affairs. So he subjected them to torture and ruthlessly executed 2,800 palace maids. Each time, Emperor Chengzu personally oversaw the executions. Emperor Shenzong of the Ming dynasty was equally cruel to the palace maids, comparable to his ancestor, Zhu Di. If a maid made even the slightest mistake, regardless of its severity, she would face severe punishment. Over 1,000 palace maids lost their lives under his orders. However, not all palace maids were willing to suffer in silence. When they were oppressed to a breaking point, some would resist. A typical example of this was the Ren'in Palace incident, in the 21st year of Emperor Jiaqing's reign, 1542. It is said that the Jiaqing emperor of the Ming dynasty, Zhu Hozong, was the 11th emperor, known for his violent temperament and frequent outbursts of anger over differing opinions. He was especially harsh toward the censor officials, those ministers who dared to speak truth to power, often punishing them with severe beatings using the yanzhang, a form of corporal punishment. What is even more shocking is that he was even more cruel toward the palace maidens. Any small mistake could result in them being whipped. And it is believed that over 200 palace maids were beaten to death by him. Unable to endure any longer, the palace maids finally revolted in the famous Ren'in Palace coup of the 21st year of Jiaqing, 1542. The coup was masterminded by Wang Ningpin and others, with more than 10 palace maids, including Yang Jinin, planning the attack. On the day of the coup, the Jiaqing emperor was asleep. Seizing the opportunity, the palace maids used a yellow silk cloth to loop around his neck and pulled tightly, attempting to strangle him. However, the knot on the silk cloth was too tight, and they failed. The maids then resorted to stabbing him with hairpins and other sharp objects. At that moment, a frightened maid, fearing the plot would be exposed, quickly informed Empress Fang. Empress Fang rushed to the scene and managed to stop the maids' actions, restraining them in time. In the end, all the palace maids involved in the assassination attempt were executed. Wang Ningpin and consort Chao Duan, who were believed to be the masterminds behind the plot, were also put to death. There is still controversy over whether consort Chao was wrongfully accused. As commented by some historians, as long as the white-haired palace maid is there, she sits idly and talks about Emperor Xuanzong. This saying reflects the tragic lives of ancient palace maids. Their youth was trapped in the inner palace, with no escape, their entire lives subject to the whims and abuses of the royal family. They had no freedom or dignity while alive, and even in death, they were denied a peaceful resting place. Such a fate is almost unimaginable for us today. This is the History and Culture channel. Liking and subscribing are the greatest help and support to us. Thank you everyone and see you in the next time.